Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is David Hillard. I'm the National Practice Group Leader of our pro bono practice. And sadly, I'm not Shay McCartney, who is an apology for this morning, and I'm going to do a much worse job than she would. So if you're going to be disappointed, it's effectively Shay's fault anyway. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today? And I know we're meeting across the country. For me, I meet on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's wonderful to be joined by many friends today from across Australia. It's wonderful just to be able to wear a collared shirt. I think this might be the second time I've done so in the last 4.5 months. Today we have a panel of our workplace relations, employment and safety lawyers who are going to talk about some key health and safety issues as they particularly apply to those in the not-for-profit sector. Those issues today that we're going to look at include a refresher on officer due diligence and the Workplace Health and Safety Act, the health and safety of workers during COVID-19, including how to safely return people to the workplace, managing and understanding operational impacts and balancing competing needs, communications with workers, and mental health impacts, the silent risk of mental health. Rather than bombard you with slides, we're going to send you a pack of information following today. You'll have to look at our smiling faces throughout today rather than have the relief of being able to look at the occasional slide. The panel today is happy to take questions through the course of the presentation, or we can save some up for the end. You'll be able to see on your screen that there is a chat function in which you can type in any questions that you have, and I'll be able to read those and relay them to the panel as we go along. We've got two fantastic special counsel today joining us. We have Hilary in our Brisbane office and Oshie in our Sydney office, who are really happy to be able to take us through some of these really key issues today. Thank you everyone for working through the awkwardness of COVID life. I apologise in advance if I have to disappear very quickly to stop a dog from barking. That's entirely seamless, and that would have happened if we were in the office anyway. So let's get started. Hilary, I think you've got the first subject today about officer due diligence. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is officer due diligence and whether it applies to not-for-profit organisations?
Yes, thanks, David. Yes, officer due diligence does apply to not-for-profit organisations. So a not-for-profit organisation is still subject to the Workplace Health and Safety Act and the Workplace Health and Safety regulations. If it falls within the concept of what's known as, if what's known as a PCBU, so a person conducting a business or undertaking. Generally, not-for-profit organisations will fall within that concept if they are not a purely volunteer organisation, which means that they are a volunteer organisation run and manned by volunteers without any employees and working together for a community purpose. So generally we assume that not-for-profits will fall within that definition of a PCBU, and that means that they then have to comply with the officer due diligence obligations. So what is that? Well, the Workplace Health and Safety Act imposes personal liability on officers of an organisation. And those are normally people like your directors, company secretaries, people who make or participate in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of the business or undertaking. And they are required under the Act to exercise what's known as due diligence to ensure the health, to ensure that the PCBU actually complies with its health and safety duties under the Act. So it's a personal obligation on the officer, and it's a distinct obligation from that applies to the PCBU. So you can actually, a breach can occur by either the PCBU or by the officer. They're not sort of completely related. So yes, it does apply.
And given that it applies, and particularly given the times that we now find ourselves in with COVID-19, what are the sorts of things that officers of a not-for-profit need to do in order to be able to discharge their officer due diligence duties?
Sure. So the WHS Act actually helpfully provides a checklist of things that the officers are required to do to meet their due diligence obligations. And just to summarise that quickly and relate that back to COVID, you need to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of WHS matters. So in terms of COVID, that could include things like maintaining up-to-date knowledge of what's happening in your particular state or territory, or even your particular suburb, if that's a sort of known hotspot. Keeping up to date with relevant health directives and advice from the authorities, following government advice in relation to COVID. You need to understand your organisation's operations, and in particular the hazards and risks that apply to your organisation. So in terms of COVID, that could be understanding your business-specific WHS COVID risks. Are you an organisation, for example, with frontline customer-facing staff? What does that mean in terms of specific risks from COVID for your organisation? You've got to ensure that there's sufficient resources to minimise risks and ensure that those processes are being utilised. So making sure your resourcing is adequate even during these sort of difficult times. You've got to consider timely response to information about and obtain that about hazards and risks. So switching back to COVID again, that could be something like making sure you're reviewing your policies and procedures and ensuring that they really do adequately deal with COVID risks. Communicating those processes to your staff and ensuring that they're followed. You've got to ensure as an officer that there's a process to ensure compliance with the WHS Act, and verify that that's happening. So this could be making sure you're communicating things to your staff, providing workers with instructions and training them on how to manage COVID risks, and above all that verification piece, David, just to make sure that all of these things are actually happening.
And I take from what you just explained that perhaps it's not sufficient to just assume that nothing changes as a result of COVID-19, that there's a need to sort of specifically look at how COVID affects what otherwise might not have been WHS kind of considerations in the past.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, David, carry on.
And I imagine that there are now a whole lot of different competing needs that organisations just haven't had to deal with before. You talked a little bit earlier about sort of sending that the needs to sort of have a safe environment and things. I assume that there are, I know it's the case at our organisation, that it's not always feasible to send, for example, everybody home who's performing sort of business critical services. How do you work through the balancing of those sorts of decisions?
So you're right, David. I think COVID-19 has really introduced some unique challenges from a health and safety perspective, and often competing needs. How do you keep the business running whilst at the same time making sure we're ensuring health and safety so far as reasonably practicable of our workers and also the others that might be coming into our workplace. For example, in some organisations, it might not actually be feasible to send everybody home, and in fact it might create unintended and additional health and safety risks if we're sending people home and they were doing critical safety functions. So it's important for organisations to balance and to manage those competing risks, and one of the most important ways they can do that is to undertake specific risk assessments. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the risks I think we see from COVID here. How do you manage for things, for example, like how do you manage social distancing in your workplace? How do you manage the risks of people contracting the virus from shared spaces or community areas? How do you manage workers who've been identified as vulnerable workers by, the health authorities? Overall, really, organisations have to remember the requirements to ensure, you have to ensure the health and safety, but as so far as reasonably practicable. So it's not an absolute obligation, but they do need to balance what can be those competing needs within the organisation.
And just of interest, is the legislation a uniform piece of legislation across the country? Is every state, are we effectively talking about the same sets of legal obligations, or does it differ from state to state?
So it's generally what we would call harmonised legislation. So most of the states, except for Victoria and WA, who are singing to their own tune, have harmonised health and safety legislation. And so we're talking about a sort of mirror or similar obligations and duties throughout the country. And even in terms of Victoria and WA, where their legislation on the ground is slightly different, generally the obligations that we're talking about today will apply. So to ensuring, that health and safety of your workers.
Okay. And I guess that just talking about the states themselves, I mean, there are different states and different territories are in vastly different situations at the moment in terms of COVID response. You're in Brisbane, where I think there's been a return to the workforce for many organisations, whereas anyone in Victoria is a long way from that at the moment. Oshie, I might bring you in. What are some of the steps that employers should be taking about deciding and dealing with workers who are returning to the office or to the workplace?
Well, thanks, David, and thanks everyone for joining us, and really happy to be here with you this morning. The starting point for dealing with the COVID risk associated with returning to work is understanding that it's a work health safety risk like many others. And that means that it's not, you've got no choice. It's a requirement of the WHS Acts across all the states and territories that you assess the risk, that you do that in consultation with workers and certain other parties, and that you implement appropriate controls having regard to the risk and having regard to the circumstances of your particular workplace. So in that sense, the issue of returning to work in a COVID context has to be dealt with in the same way as any other work health safety risk. Now, having said that, we know that there are a number of unique or at least unusual features of the situation that we're dealing with now. One of them, for example, is that the situation is always changing. So that means that one particular feature of your risk assessment, your consultation and your control measures in respect of COVID is that they have to be continually reviewed, and then you have to stay right on top of the official guidance generally, and the situation in your particular local area and the way that impacts on your workers in your workplace. A second unusual or particular feature of responding in a COVID context is that consultation is going to be absolutely key. That's both consultation with your workers, speaking to them about their concerns, taking the information that they have, which is often very valuable, and understanding their perspective on these things. It also means consultation with others. For example, the obvious one is building managers, people that control your facilities, that deal with lifts, lobbies, all of those sorts of things. There's a need to consult with those parties as well. The third particular feature of COVID is that there's likely to be a really high level of concern among your employees. Firstly, about leaving the office. Some people will have concerns about having moved out of the office and moved away from the old or the traditional way of doing things. And there'll be another group of people who are concerned about coming back to the office. So it's really crucial to understand your employees' particular concerns and address them as best you can. You're not likely to be able to eliminate them completely, but there are things that you can do. So obviously, eliminating risk as far as possible and putting your control measures in place will help address people's concerns. Communication is key, not only as a statutory requirement, but just as good practice, setting clear expectations and rules about return to work, what you expect of your workers and what they can expect of you. Informing people about their entitlements in terms of leave and so on will help to some extent set people's mind at ease, and providing information about support, whether it's support that your organisation is providing internally or that might be available externally. Now, in terms of specific steps that can be taken or that need to be taken, they'll vary almost infinitely because workplaces vary almost infinitely. The 3 quick pointers. Number 1, you need to understand what you're going to do if someone's infected or suspected of being infected with COVID. So it's no good to wait for that to happen and then work out how you're going to respond. The second issue is that if you've been out of the office or the workplace, whatever it is, for a while, you need to think about the risks that are associated with the return. So a common one for the office environment is that if your air conditioning has been off for a while and you turn it back on, there are issues that arise, potential risks that arise there. So there'll be a whole variety of things, but that's just one example. And finally, and again, consultation is going to be key, both with your staff and with others.
Thank you, Oshie. There are a couple of questions that have come through that I think are probably worth asking now rather than saving us to the end. But they're both in relation to, I think, one of the other really unusual features of the current environment, which is about staff now working from home. And one of the questions that's been asked is, well, we've got staff working from home and we've made sure that they've got proper desks and chairs, etc. But is it also our responsibility to remind staff to sanitise and wear face masks when they leave the home? Is that something we need to do? And is it in fact the case that, shouldn't we expect that staff members are working from home are just as able to keep informed and up to date about what health risks are as we are as the organisation? Do either of you, I know it's a question without notice, but do either of you have any sorts of views on what that working from home arrangement does and how that might change some of these responsibilities?
Sure. I might jump in on this one, Oshie, unless you want to. But the working from home, David, I think it's important to remember that, and I think somebody mentioned this to me the other day, that that's actually effectively, in a way, becoming people's workplaces if you aren't able to attend into the actual, what was your former, office. And so because people are working from home, it doesn't sort of mean that an employer or a PCBU doesn't have any obligations towards that worker. In fact, you still have that duty of care and you still have to ensure their health and safety so far as reasonably practicable. And I think working from home can create a whole raft of other issues, which I think we'll probably be talking a little bit more about towards the end of this panel, in terms of isolation and supervision and, all of those sorts of things. But one of the things that an employer or an organisation is still required to do is make sure that their workers are safe if they are working from home as a workplace. So that might mean that it might not be reasonably practicable at the moment to have undertaken a wholesale ergonomics review of everybody's workstations and working from home, but you might be sending that information out to your workers and telling them how, this is how you can set up your workplace at home and setting in some structures and undertaking some risk assessments. But there are still boundaries around that relationship, David, and it doesn't mean that an employer is then responsible for every ambit of its employee's life. And I think that sort of setting those boundaries around when someone is at work and when they are at home becomes even more difficult when your workplace is your home, essentially. And so I think when someone's, for example, if you're working from home, you are effectively putting in some of the controls that have been recommended in terms of trying to eliminate the risk of COVID. One of the most successful controls for that, which is why it's being so widely implemented up until recently in some states, is that working from home. It's an isolation. So you're effectively limiting the amount of time that people spend with other people in the workplace and getting to work and so on. So I think, but there are boundaries. So if someone's leaving home to go to the shops and so on, that could be in their personal capacity. There's a point, I guess, where an employer doesn't then have to control every aspect of an employee's life. And I think we can be reminding our employees about the importance of hygiene, the importance of social distancing. For example, if they're in Victoria and it's mandatory to wear a mask, but I don't think we have to control every aspect. The obligation is what is so far as reasonably practicable. So I hope that answers that question, but let us know in the comments if you want any more on that.
Thank you. One of the other questions that has been asked is about this same issue in relation to working from, in relation to, you said travelling into work.
Yes.
At the moment, again, sitting here in Sydney, there are presumably some things I need to be told, or at least I should be doing, if I'm travelling into the office. Is a workplace responsible for telling workers how they should travel to work, or giving them information about their travel into work?
So I think in terms of responsible, that's an interesting one. So the obligations, obviously, under the health and safety legislation, are for when you're in your workplace. So as an employer, you're not necessarily responsible for controlling factors outside of the workplace. There might be other legislation, for example, journey claims under workers' compensation legislation might come into it. Say, for example, in Queensland, Oshie might have to jump in on New South Wales on that one. But in terms of the public transport aspect, that is something that I think employers do need to bear into mind, not necessarily because they control the public transport or because it's their workplace, but because, of course, people coming into work and travelling into work, if they are more at risk of potentially catching the COVID-19 virus on their way into work, that could create increased risk when you're in the workplace. So there are some controls and recommendations that Safe Work Australia and other guidance material has recommended. And so, for example, you might think about how can we help our employees. So we might stagger our start and finishing times. We might change people's duties in a way so that they don't have to come in at certain times. We might rotate things. We might embrace flexible working practices. And what that's designed to do is potentially make sure that people are not all potentially catching public transport at the same time. One of the other hierarchy, what they call the hierarchy of controls in the safety space, where you sort of start with your strongest one is eliminate, which we aren't able to do with COVID because there's no vaccine at the moment, but you sort of then go down in terms of what controls you can use, and PPE is a control, and it's a different issue there, but you might be able to, for example, I think in New South Wales, the government's recommended that if you are catching public transport, for example, and you're in a confined space where you can't manage the social distancing, that's recommended you wear a mask, for example. It's not mandatory in New South Wales, but that's some of the recommendations. So you're not necessarily, as an employer, responsible for the public transport health and safety side, but I think you do absolutely have to take it into consideration for what risks that can bring into your business and what controls you might be able to put in place to manage that. And I think it ties into the mental health concerns or the anxiety that people might be facing in terms of returning to the actual physical workplace. Oshie, is there anything you wanted to jump in on that?
Yeah, two things fairly quickly. One is that, apart from agreeing with everything Hilary's just said, this question of transport might also be relevant to the question of whether you can actually legitimately direct your employees to come to work, because it may bear on the question of whether it's reasonable to direct someone to come into work as opposed to working from home, and we might talk about that a bit later on. The second issue is that this question of the boundary between work and non-work, it's always been unclear, and it's increasingly so as time's gone on with social media and remote working and all the rest of it. And we've now just gone into a whole other universe of complexity about it. And it's very interesting for the lawyers, and there'll be a very interesting case or series of cases about it in due course. Speaking for myself, if I were managing an organisation, I would not want to be part of that very interesting test case. I'd prefer to be a long way away from it, watching someone else deal with it. So in terms of deciding, am I strictly responsible for this or not, even if you think you might not be strictly liable, it might just be a good idea to err on the side of caution.
That's a good ad for not trying to get anybody to become a test case. It's never a good thing. I think there are some particular challenges that many not-for-profit organisations in our audience today are going to face, particularly where there's organisations which provide services or work alongside people with disabilities or who have particular illnesses. Could you talk a little bit, maybe Hilary, about some of the challenges that the COVID response presents to WHS issues in those circumstances?
Certainly. Look, I think you're right, David. I think people with disabilities and illnesses and the type of work that a lot of not-for-profit organisations undertake can really create some unique challenges in the COVID space. So, for example, I think the people with disabilities have been included in some of the health criteria or categorisation as being particularly vulnerable to catching COVID-19 because potentially they have underlying illnesses or issues that might make them more prevalent to catching COVID-19. The other issue, I think, is that people with disabilities require care, and so they then have, and quite sometimes very close contact, and that then I think can also increase the risk. So you're almost having a double whammy there in sense of the person is potentially more vulnerable to catching this particular illness, and they are requiring care, which requires them to come into contact with people more frequently than someone who doesn't have those concerns. And so I think that then heightens the risks and requires a particular care from not-for-profit organisations dealing with these matters that they really are factoring in. And I think Oshie was talking about this previously. We really need to be taking a risk-based approach to these matters and to making sure that organisations have really appropriate COVID-19 pandemic response plans in place, that your risk assessments are really carefully considering the vulnerable nature of the people that you're dealing with, but also our own workers and our own frontline staff dealing with these matters. I mean, if we are having customer-facing staff in a not-for-profit and we need to still be providing those services to particularly disadvantaged areas of the community that really need them, what are we going to be doing to help protect our frontline staff and making sure that we are ensuring their health and safety so far as reasonably practicable, as well as that of the people that we're caring for. So I think as Oshie says, the different workplaces are infinite, and there's not a one-size-fits-all, but very much this risk-based approach, making sure that organisations really are coming back to their risk assessments and looking at the information, and there's a lot of information now out there. We're obviously still learning about COVID every day, but really taking that back into your own organisation and applying it to the own risks and issues that apply within your own organisation.
And we've talked, and in all of our answers, we talked about staff and employees and things. Many of the organisations we're talking to today have volunteers and substantial numbers of volunteers. Does that change anything in relation to what we've been discussing so far, if you've got a volunteer workforce?
It doesn't change the obligation, David, for the organisation to ensure their health and safety. So the categorisation of a worker is incredibly broad, and it can include people who are working in your business but potentially not being paid. They might be volunteering within your business. So this is a distinct and different issue from what we're talking about, whether you're covered by the Act at all. But if you're volunteering within an organisation, you're still entitled to those protections of the Act, and to make sure that the organisation is really carefully considering it. And I think volunteers also bring in their own idiosyncrasies, as it were, because from an employment sort of related perspective, and it then some of your ability to control your volunteers is a bit more limited than if they're your own staff. But there are some useful provisions in the WHS Act where someone who's a worker has an obligation to ensure their own health and safety, and they also have an obligation to comply with reasonable directions to ensure health and safety from the organisation. So don't feel like your hands are tied. There are ways and means in which you can make sure that those really particular COVID pandemic plans that you're putting in place can actually and are actually being enforced by your workers and your volunteers.
Okay. Can we talk about masks for a moment, because they're an increasing issue in many jurisdictions. Should organisations from a WH&S perspective make their employees wear masks? Is that something that the legislation requires or that we would recommend?
It's not a requirement, David, I mean, other than in Victoria, for example. So Victoria, so far, is the only state which has mandated the use of masks. I know New South Wales has recommended the use of masks in certain areas, so for example, in public transport, or where you're in a social or in a confined space where you can't maintain social distancing. But there's no sort of specific requirement on a company at the moment, other than in Victoria, to mandate that people wear masks. Now, I think we need to go back to the sort of hierarchy of controls and look at where that masks sort of sit in that, and what's the kind of the purpose and the point behind masks. And masks at the moment, I think, are intended to help prevent community transmission. So there's only certain very particular masks that actually provide a complete protection, if you can say that, against COVID. And that would be, there's some very, N95 and particular masks that they're wearing in the medical space. So what Victoria is mandating, for example, is a even a cloth covering over your face, or as long as it has 3 layers of material. That's not necessarily going to provide a complete protection against COVID. And the reason that the idea behind it is it's required by the Victorian government as a method of trying to prevent community transmission. So it might prevent you infecting somebody else. It might not necessarily stop you getting infected. I think that's the issue behind masks that perhaps a lot of people are not realizing. So back to our employer and our own organisation. We come back to our lawful and reasonable direction piece. Can an employer provide a lawful and reasonable direction to employees? I think that will depend on your own organisation and your risk assessment of whether you think that that's going to assist in controlling those risks in your workplace, and sort of taking it from there. If you're mandating it as well, I think that then brings in some more complexity. Lawyers love complexity under the Act, because if we are mandating something, it may become what's called PPE, so personal protective equipment. And if it becomes PPE, then there are specific requirements under the Act in terms of things like fit. We have to supply it without cost to the employee. We have to make sure it fits properly. We have to give training. There's a variety of requirements on there. So I think employers need to approach this space carefully and not just knee-jerk into providing that lawful and a direction, and then we'll then step back as, is it a lawful and reasonable direction? What does that mean? Are we then setting ourselves up for making it PPE and so on? So, and also remembering where it sits in our hierarchy of controls as to what it can actually achieve.
And I assume the people we see outside Bunnings with video cameras go to work as well, and there may well be employees who refuse to wear a mask, even if you ask them to do so. Masks, I assume, aren't the beginning and end of the obligations in relation to protections in the workplace for workers and volunteers.
No, that's right. So that's right. So some people might refuse to wear masks. They might have religious or other grounds. There might be a variety of reasons why they want to refuse, and I think that's really then important as to whether we've really taken that careful assessment of the risks in our organisation, and can we substantiate that is a lawful and reasonable direction to control this risk, that they must wear that mask. So I think that's the first point. The second point is a lot of the organisations we're talking about here in terms of not-for-profit might be dealing with people with disabilities, and one of even in Victoria, for example, where it's mandated, they recognise that not everybody is required to wear masks, and so people who have disabilities, it's not mandated that they wear a mask, and they might not fully appreciate why they need to wear a mask or be able to actually physically comply with sort of recommended practices when you're using masks. So one of the recommendations, for example, is that you should always sanitize your hands before you put on a mask and before you take off a mask, because otherwise you're potentially simply just transferring the germs that you've touched onto your face or on the mask, and you might be negating the whole point and purpose of the mask. So there's a certain point where potentially the people that in our not-for-profit sector that we're talking about today, the people that we're caring for might not be able to wear masks or might not be able to comply with what makes masks a control, if we want to call it that. But so if we can't get people to wear masks, what else can we do? Well, I think we then need to go back to our hierarchy of controls, and we need to go back to our risk assessments and look at if we do we then mandate that our employees and our volunteers wear the masks so that we can protect those, to help provide more protection to the people that we're caring for who aren't able to wear the masks. That's something to look at. And are we then looking at I guess going back to our risk assessment and our ability to look at our other controls, what other steps can we take in terms of that hierarchy that help provide that protection? So one of the reasons why government and the health authorities sort of haven't introduced mandatory mask wearing to date is because they were concerned, from all the reading I've done, that it might actually introduce almost like a complacency and people stop some of the other controls like social distancing and isolation. So I think what you then do is go back to some of the more controls higher up on the hierarchy about what we can do to help protect that, and not simply just look at the mask as a control in isolation.
Okay, thanks. Can I shift gears for a minute? And Oshie, I want to talk about returning to work. What happens if an employer opens up and employees don't want to come back to work? Can an employer make people come back into the office or come back into the workplace?
It would have been nice if Hilary dealt with this question as well, because it's not an easy one. But I'll do my best. The starting point is that an employee is required to follow any lawful and reasonable direction, and conversely, an employee is not required to follow a direction which is unlawful or unreasonable. Now, the first thing that has to happen is that you as an employer need to have complied with your own statutory obligations in terms of risk assessment, consultation and control. Because if you haven't done that and your workplace isn't as safe as it can be, then it's not going to be reasonable, and it's perhaps potentially going to be unlawful to require your staff to return to that workplace. So the first thing is, if you're going to give that direction and it's going to be effective, you need to have done everything that you need to do from your end. A second thing that has to be borne in mind is that one size will not fit all. So it might be quite reasonable to direct person A, who's a fit and healthy 25-year-old with no vulnerabilities, to come into work. It might be quite a different situation for someone who's in a vulnerable position, who lives with a vulnerable person, and so on. And there are various permutations of that. For example, we were talking about public transport. It might be that for one person who walks into work, that's not a factor. It might be that someone else who can only get into work catching a busy train at peak hour, and the direction might be unreasonable or conceivably unlawful. So you'll need to take into account the individual circumstances of your employees in determining whether a person can be required to come back. Now,
Oshie, can I just ask on that point? Somebody has asked us, and I think it's a very live question, is if an employer then says, well, we only want the fit and healthy workers to come in and the rest of you should continue to stay at home because you're vulnerable or at risk, does that raise potential discrimination issues for an employer? Can somebody who's over the age of 65, for example, say, well, I'm being told I can't come into work when others can? There's an age discrimination complaint. We talked about complexity. Let me just throw a little bit more into there.
Sure. Look, there is a huge amount of complexity, and we could spend all day talking about the difficulty of discrimination law and the way that it varies from state to state and so on. But I think if we try to simplify that, it really comes down to this. The law doesn't prohibit distinction or discrimination. It prohibits particular types of discrimination. And if people are being treated differently for legitimate reasons, that is, reasons that are related to genuine occupational qualifications, are related to work health safety obligations or other other reasons that don't involve assumptions about people's ability, that don't involve a preconceived view about what someone can do, you're probably going to be okay. So happy to talk about the legal ins and outs, but I think if you needed a guiding principle, that would be it. You've got to make sure that it's not that you can't treat people differently, but if you are, you've got to make sure that you're doing it for a legitimate reason, and that it's not based on an assumption about what someone can do or someone's capacity or vulnerability. It's based on actually properly understanding those things.
And so, from what I hear you saying, perhaps sort of the general rule of thumb is to avoid employers making directions about anybody or large groups of having to come into the office and really leaving that for consideration of individual circumstances. Is that a sort of a safer sort of rule of thumb to deal with these?
Look, from a perspective of absolutely reducing legal risk, you spend days and days talking to each individual about their particular situation and working out a bespoke plan for each person. But realistically, there aren't many organisations that are going to be able to make that happen. Yeah. So at the end of the day, if you need people to be at work, many organisations probably on this on the conference today are going to be in that position, and that's what's going to happen. I think what you need to do is make sure that you have a capacity to take feedback and understand each individual situation. That doesn't mean it's a matter of approaching each person one by one and talking about, asking them whether they want to come in and so on. But it's a matter of if you're giving a broader direction, that has to be subject to an ability for each individual to identify their particular concerns and work with you to find the best possible way through for them.
If we talk, you mentioned talking about communications, which I gather is very important in terms of having a workplace or a workforce that may not necessarily everyone in the office. How have you got suggestions or ideas about how you best communicate with people when they're working from home?
Yeah, and look, before talking about how you do it, can I just briefly say it really is crucial. It's crucial firstly because you've got to do it as part of your consultation obligation, and that's consultation that has to be ongoing because things are changing all the time. The second thing is that it's going to help manage the impacts of mental health on your workforce, and we might talk about that a bit more if we have time. And the third reason is it's really just key to productivity and having people work effectively is, of course, is communicating with them. Now, how do you do it? To me, the first and biggest step that each organisation can take is just prioritising staying in touch with people. Things that just happened as a matter of course because we're all in the same office, walking into each other's offices or walking to each other's desks 10 times a day, they just don't happen. And they're not going to happen unless you bring that about. So I think it's really key to pause and ask yourselves and talk to your line managers and people managers how we're going to make this happen, and to really demonstrate that now this is a priority and something that the organisation is committed to doing. How do you implement that? Again, it's going to vary in the same way that workplaces vary. I mean, the obvious one is video conferencing, what we're doing today, and for a lot of organisations that'll be the best option. Phone calls, if it's possible to meet occasionally, great. To my mind, email and text message is if that's all you can do, great. But to me, that's a long way short of some of these other options. And one thing I will say about video conferencing is, particularly if you're talking about team catch-ups, when you meet in person, even as a large group, there are always opportunities for individual sort of one-on-one or small group interactions. And the way that people interact in that sort of situation is different to the way they'll interact if they're on the stage with all eyes on them. And if you're talking about an online meeting, you don't have those opportunities, and that's really it means that, you know, meeting on Zoom or Skype or something with everyone's picture on the screen is not the same as getting together in person as you would have done in the past. So I think it's important that you can have those group meetings, that social interaction as well as work interaction, but it's also important that there be smaller, really one-on-one interaction as far as possible. So to my mind, that's something that managers need to prioritise as well, is having, whether it's phone calls or whatever it is, with individuals as well, because there are things that people will say directly to one person that they won't be comfortable talking about in a group situation.
So eight people meeting every day for an hour by Zoom is not the only answer, the only necessary response to making sure that there's good communication between an organisation and its staff. It's very sensible.
It's part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer.
You've mentioned mental health. Can you talk a little bit about why mental health during this current situation is what we would call a silent risk? What are the big issues around mental health and the situation we're in at the moment from an employment perspective?
This is a really fascinating and important issue from a work health safety and an HR perspective. The mathematical fact is that the number of people who will contract COVID is a small fraction of the number of people who will be affected by our efforts to combat the virus. And it's known both from research now and from research of earlier pandemics that there are very significant mental health impacts that arise in these sort of situations in terms of generalised stress and anxiety for really almost everyone, and even more severe impacts on people who have a pre-existing vulnerability of whatever kind, who are managing that okay when things are normal, who might find it much more difficult to manage in these sorts of situations. So it is a real issue, and understandably our efforts are focused first and foremost on combating the infection, but this is also, it's a really significant risk that has to be borne in mind and has to be combated. And there are any number of reasons why mental health can be under pressure during these sorts of times. Isolation is a really big one, and a work-related issue, that the connection that most of us have with our work colleagues and everyone else, the person in the coffee shop, the person who's at the bus stop, everything else, that connection for a lot of us disappears, and that can be really taxing. And then there's the degree of difficulty that's associated with going from working in the office to working at home, and fears about redundancies. What's going to happen to my organisation? Am I going to still have a job in a few weeks? All of these things affect different people different ways, but they can all have very significant impacts.
And given that so many exist, Oshie, what can an organisation do? What should an organisation be doing proactively now about all of these potential mental health challenges?
Yeah, the one starting point is the advice of the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Pandemic Response Plan. Very high level necessarily, but some of the suggestions that they've given us are making sure that there is supervision and support opportunities, especially for employees who are working from home. Increased opportunities for training and professional development, including to deal with the new work reality that we deal with. Making sure that you're conscious of addressing staff shortages as much as possible, where people can't work or work's being done less productively, understanding that that's an issue and doing what you can to help manage that additional burden. Implementing mental health initiatives internally to the extent that you can, EAP, but that's just the starting point. And then pointing workers to other sources of support which are available outside the workforce. Probably easy to articulate at that level. Real challenges are translating it into action, but it's something that has to be done. It's easy to ignore for a while, but we're just going to have to come to grips with it. It's not going to be easy, but every employer and every organisation is just going to have to address this issue of mental health of staff sooner or later.
And we're now into month 5. It's not like this is something which is about to suddenly disappear for us. It's very much a sort of continuing reality, I guess, that employers can't take comfort in the fact that if I can ignore this for a few weeks and it will go away is really not the current reality, I think.
Absolutely. And one other thing I should say that might be particularly relevant for some of the people that are with us today is that everything that I've said goes for even those of us who have pretty comfortable jobs sitting behind desks, in the home office. For people who are on the front line, it applies obviously to an even greater extent. And again, there's plenty of research that's identified that PTSD is a real issue for frontline workers who have had to deal with these things. And that's said we're into month 5. That may only be the start, because some of the impacts can last for a long, long time.
We've got a few minutes left. Can I encourage, I've certainly asked questions as we've gone along that people have entered. If you have any more questions, please let us know. One specific question, I guess, that's very pertinent right now as I sit in Sydney. What happens if there's a second wave in the area in which somebody is working or where your organisation is based? Are there extra things, particular things that organisations should do if they see that numbers are rising in their suburb or in their community?
Yes, absolutely. And this really reinforces the need for the constant reassessment and vigilance that we spoke about a bit earlier, and the need to stay on top of guidance generally and in the local area, because it's essential to understand really from day to day how things are changing. Now, how do you prepare for the second wave, or how do you establish systems that guard against that risk appropriately? Number one, you need to review your controls to understand if they'll be effective if there's another outbreak or a spike in infections. It's crucial to systemically identify risk factors. So that's not just sort of thinking about it here and there and having it in the back of your mind. It's about systemic assessment, consultation, and implementing controls. Continuing consultation with workers and others is going to be key, and staying on top of developments. At the end of the day, what needs to happen is a continual reassessment of the efficacy of the controls that you have for work from home, and understanding the point at which isolation, work from home, becomes the appropriate and the necessary control, and understanding in your own organisation's mind when that point is reached and when you need to take that step, I think is key.
Thank you. So what I might do is, in terms of if people have any other questions, we're very happy if you want to send them through to us, and we'll be happy to get back to you. As I said at the beginning, we're also going to send around some materials that have been prepared for the not-for-profit sector and COVID-19 that we'll make available to everyone who's attended today. Can I thank, on behalf of all of you, I know you're clapping very loudly back in your office or in your home, to both Hilary and Oshie for their work today. Please don't make this a set and forget. If there are questions that you've got, or if there are issues that you want to raise with us, Clayton Utz is very happy to be able to continue to offer assistance to all of you in the not-for-profit sector to get through what are incredibly difficult and, dare I use the cliche, of unprecedented times. Hilary and Oshie, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your attendance, and I look forward to a time we can all meet together in person. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Oshie.
Bye-bye.